All right, can you hear outside of the room? Because you got a speaker, yay. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Aubrey Williams. I'm one of the co-founders here at Heartwork Brewing. I also am a certified beer server and coincidentally a daughter of the American Revolution. So this year's like our Super Bowl. And in the spirit of authenticity, our air conditioner is slacking. So you get to experience a 1776 tavern here without AC. So welcome. That's really all you need to know about me, but I want to give Dr. Bochman a chance to introduce himself because together we'll be co-teaching sort of a ping pong presentation of, science and history behind 250 years of American beer.
Hi everybody, I'm Matt Bochman. I'm chair of the biochemistry department up at IU here. More germane to this, I'm the local yeast whisperer. So I just refer to myself as a yeast guy. So we're gonna get into what that means here. But I've worked with Upland and Function when it was still around, and a bunch of other breweries, and so it's great to keep that going, and it's great to be here tonight. So thanks for showing up.
All right, so we start off every beer school that I have with this slide, and it's really what is beer? And it's one of the oldest and most widely consumed alcoholic drinks in the world, and actually in the sphere of all drinks, it's number 3 after water and tea globally. So we're number 3 here. Dr. Bochman's gonna get more into the brewing and the fermentation of it, but a lot of modern beer for, preservation reasons, different reasons, bitterness and taste includes hops. And then last year, the U.S. beer market was a $113 billion industry. And so, again, a very important beverage, not just globally, but also economically. So I like to read this quote from an entry in the diary from the Mayflower passenger that says, "We could not now take time for further search, our victuals being much spent, especially our beer." So we often hear the phrase that beer saved the world. They didn't necessarily know why it was safer than water, right? Like they just kind of knew that people who drank ale tended to do better, I guess you'd say. And they actually were considered pretty major dietary staples. So you could hear liquid bread is a way that they referred to it. He's going to talk a little bit about the ingredients that, were used in North America. But what would happen is that as they would come over on these ships, even though good water was actually much more plentiful in this new world, they brought with them from Europe a distrust in the water quality. And so you can often see that they were bringing equipment, recipes, things like that in order to create these beers and ales. And additionally, along with other chores like baking and cooking, a lot of the brewing was done by women. Okay, so that's a little bit different than what we're used to seeing. I feel like the modern brewer has a beard and tattoos and a death metal t-shirt and looks just like my husband. So I think that it was just a little bit of a different time, and they were consuming it significantly more. Americans drink 2.3 gallons of alcohol per capita annually today. Back then, they were drinking 34 gallons of beer and cider a year, comparatively, right? And then 5 gallons of spirits and a gallon of wine. Like the volume that they were drinking. Again, these were the folks that survived. So I ground rules for tasting beer. I throw these out here because I was telling someone earlier, if you are here, this means you're a nerd. You might be a beer nerd, you're a history nerd, or you are both. Maybe actually adding chemistry and all that stuff. We're all nerds here together. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we like every style of beer that we're going to taste. So just be open to new styles. When I was first starting to taste beers, I would have told somebody I don't like sours. I don't like IPAs. The reality is I hadn't tried enough of them. I hadn't figured out that all sours weren't funky, a lot of them were fruity, or that there were IPAs that were less bitter and some that were more or less piney. So ask for recommendations. Never be intimidated by a craft beer menu. When you're up at the bar, tell them what you like. I don't care if you tell them, like my dad would, like, I like Coors Light. Like, what's the closest thing, we can get? And choose what you enjoy. Don't drink a pint just because somebody else says it's the cool beer. Drink what you enjoy. So with that, we will kick off with, if you have our flights, if you're following along, the first beer that we're going to be tasting is declaration of fermentation. So I'll give a brief description of it and then hand it off to Dr. Bochman to talk about what really went into this beer. But it really has a balanced profile, sweet and biscuity malt. I think some of our bartenders were saying it reminds them of, it's kind of like a funky English mild.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And it was a collaboration between Indiana University and all of the Bloomington local craft brewing scene, including breweries that are going to be opening soon. So feel free to go ahead and start sipping that, and I'll turn it over to Matt to talk about it.
All right, can we click to the next one here? Yeah, so thank you. This whole thing came about, I guess, the fall of last year. The deans all got together and said, hey, 2026 is coming. It's going to be the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We, as a university, we want to celebrate. We want to do this America 250 thing, and we want to have a bunch of programs going on, a bunch of events. So if you can think of something discipline specific that you can, get your faculty involved in, your students, whatever it is, let's do it. And so they always, gave the example, the physics department, if you want to do a demonstration of the ballistics of musket balls, sure, let's go ahead. And I'm in the biochemistry department. I'm thinking to myself, well, 250 years ago, biochemistry didn't exist. And I run a research lab at IU. I'm thinking, well, we use yeast as our model organism. 250 years ago, they had yeast. They didn't know what it was. So that sort of shoots me in the foot twice, right? So what am I going to do? But then I started to think, just like Aubrey said, that the founding fathers and founding mothers were home brewers. And at least before I had kids, I was a home brewer, and I drink more than 2.3 gallons of beer per year. So maybe that's something we could do. And so I came up with this idea of maybe we could make a beer that was 1776 inspired, right? George Washington has his small beer recipe. His diary is in the New York Public Library, right? So these things are still out there. Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, they all have their recipes out there. So could we recreate that? And being a boss, I'm really good at coming up with ideas and finding other people to do them. And so I quickly, contacted Upland and was like, hey, I got this idea. You guys want to get in on it? I said, yeah. And I was like, remember how there used to be collaboration beers in Bloomington every spring? What if we do that too? So not only make this beer, but make it a collaboration beer. And sure enough, Upland did all the wrangling and came up with a recipe. And I'm like, well, that's a lot of hard work for everybody else. I should bring something to the table. And so what we did was, we can't find a yeast from 250 years ago. I don't have access to that kind of stuff. Nobody would give me access because I'm not that kind of scientist. Plus, I drink more than 2.3 gallons of beer per year. But aside from corn, the other thing that Indiana has in spades are old growth hardwood forests, right? That's our number 2 export is hardwood. And on the IU campus, we have this tree. It's called the Celebra tree. It's right outside the IMU. It's so big that the branches are starting to fall down, and those are like pikes holding it up so it doesn't just crack in half. And it's estimated to be somewhere 230 to 250 years old. So when they were signing the Declaration of Independence, this thing was an itty bitty sapling, but it was there. And I thought, well, the yeast on the outside of that tree is not going to be 250 years old, but the story is there, right? It's faux historical. And so my lab and I, we went to that tree in February. It was cold. It was like right before the polar vortex. But yeast are outside. They're everywhere. They're there all the time. And brewing yeast in particular loves oak. Nobody really knows why, but if you go to oak trees, you find Saccharomyces cerevisiae, ale yeast, all the time. And sure enough, we pulled a wild ale yeast off of that tree and used it to brew this beer. So the funky notes you may be tasting are really from the yeast. Like, to me, when I get it, and I don't want to bias anybody's sensory, I get like a little bit of a banana aroma at least, and like some spicy, some clove or something like that. And the people ask me, well, what kind of beer is it? It doesn't really have a style, but it's sort of like an English mild and a farmhouse ale came together and had a baby that had some molasses and weird yeast in it. And that's what you've got. So back in the day, 1776, right, the way this recipe was built was trying to come up with something period specific, and they were British colonies, right? So they drank a lot of British style beers, and the typical British beer is an ale. It's not a lager, it's not a pilsner, it's an ale. Malt forward, pretty well balanced. You're not skewing one way or another. You're not going to get hop bombs and things like that. With low to moderate ABVs, but they did have stronger ales. But you're getting, typically notes of bread, caramel toffee, fruity yeast in there. And common examples are the ESB, a brown ale, the porter, the stout, everything you see in this picture here. And they had those types of beers in the colonies, right? George Washington was a big porter guy. He loved him some porter.
Doesn't like it.
Just do it that way.
Yeah.
But there's a problem. Barley, especially the type of barley you want to use to malt and make beer, didn't really grow well in the colonies. So how do you make beer without that ready source of malt? Sure, you can ship it over, but that has its own problems. And this is where American ingenuity comes in. Well, we're just going to find our own sources of sugar. So the malted barley is where you get the bulk of the sugar that then the yeast ferment to turn into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So one thing you can do is just make a small beer. So something that doesn't have a high ABV, and the high ABV comes from starting with a bunch of sugar. So if you only have a little bit of sugar to begin with, you can only make a small beer. And these are things like we might consider a session beer today, so sort of like 3% or below, but even down to 0.5%. And these are things that everybody drank, including kids, because if it's 0.5%, you can drink a gallon of that beer and you're not going to be impaired. And it's clean drinking water, right? It's gone through a boiling process, the whole thing, so it's safer than running out and trying somebody's well. But that only gets you so far, and still you need a malt base or some kind of sugar to do that. So they just came up with malt alternatives, right? Molasses was prevalent because we were on sort of the trade route from the Caribbean where you get lots of sugar cane. You could malt other grains. It doesn't need to be barley. So you could use bran or corn because corn is a New World grain, wheat, rye. But they also took cues from the Native Americans who were growing gourds and pumpkins and harvesting persimmons. And any place you've got a fruit or a vegetable, you've got lots of sugar there, right? You can make a beer out of green bell peppers if you want, because bell peppers are full of sugar. But green bell pepper is actually an off flavor in beer brewing, so that's why most people don't do that. And the most interesting thing I found in my research is there were brewers that actually used young corn stalks, and you could press those and get basically a syrupy juice out of them, almost like sugar cane, and made green corn stalk beer. Probably tasted all right. They did it. Also, hops and the lack thereof was another problem. Again, we didn't have hop farms in the 13 colonies, and the types of hops that people were growing didn't necessarily grow well here, right? They grow well in the Pacific Northwest. That wasn't even a thing, right, in 1776 yet. So there are wild hops that are native to America. Some of those are okay, but there's no evidence that they were farmed widely. There is evidence of people using spruce tips in beer, and again, this is a cue from Native Americans because spruce tips, not only do they have sort of that bittering or flavoring quality, but they're also full of vitamin C. And so the Native Americans used it to stave off scurvy, and what's better than beer that doesn't give you scurvy? So they would put those in, and anybody who's ever had a gruit ale, so a beer that's made without hops, a gruit is anything that you can add to a beer to have that sort of bittering, balancing flavor that isn't hops. And so this, basically, they were brewing gruits for the most part at the time.
Drink break. So we worked on the order of this flight together and trying to take you on a journey through 250 years of beer. And so one of them, the next one in line, if you're following on with the flight, is the Hefeweizen. And so I know a lot of people, they drink Hefeweizen, they think banana bread, you get those vibes, right? It's a traditional unfiltered Bavarian wheat beer. And this was a kind of controversial beer because if anyone knows about the history of German beer, they had purity laws about what ingredients could be used in these beers. So during the Reinheitsgebot, I don't speak German, but it's my best I can do, they basically almost got rid of Hefeweizen because it was, again, you could only brew beer with barley, hops, and water, and this was one with wheat. So it was definitely something that was around a long time ago and then was able to survive and continue. So feel free to jump in and taste the Hefeweizen if you're kind of going sort of semi-chronologically through the flight. Take it away.
So I guess just a note on the Hef. I thought this was a good addition because to me a Hefeweizen yeast is a cousin to the Declaration Fermentation yeast. You get that sort of banana phenolic thing from it. So hopefully you can pick up on some of those similarities. I guess the other thing I should have said is I'm from Pittsburgh, so I barely speak English. So if I say anything that anybody doesn't understand, shoot up a hand. I'll try to clarify. And also if you just have any questions, right? This is my job to answer questions all day long. So join the club.
Yeah. You know Dan's a Yinzer, right?
Oh, is that right?
He's from Aliquippa.
Oh, I love Aliquippa. All right. I'm gonna watch Steeler games with him.
Yeah. Penguins is preference.
Okay, gotcha. So brewing in 1776, and not just in the colonies but elsewhere, was labor intensive. It's still labor intensive, but it was even worse then. Many people were malting their own grain, right? You're not gonna get online and at Northern Brewer or something like that and buy a case of biscuit malt or whatever it might be. Whatever it is, your barley, your corn, your oats, your wheat, you're soaking it in water. And what that does is that activates, those are basically seeds, right? So you're germinating those seeds, and that's turning the storage energy in the seed into something that's more readily available. So complex carbs into more simple carbs. And then you have to stop that germination process, or right, the whole thing grows. And so you kiln dry that. And we do that pretty much traditionally even today, where you basically spread it out, very thin layer on a floor, right? And you're turning the malt, and that's, drying the under layers, and you're applying heat. And the way they did that was with wood fire. And so most of their malt was basically smoked malt as well, just because the smoke is going to leach into the process. So I didn't mention it, but the Declaration of Fermentation was actually made with a little bit of maple smoked malt from Sugar Creek Malt up in Lebanon, Indiana. So once you've gone through that whole multi-day process to get your grain ready to go, then you're actually into the brewing process, right? So you mash in, and basically that means you're taking those malted grains and you steep it in water. And what that does is activates enzymes in the grains that further break down those sugars. So you go from a very complex carbohydrate to something simpler, and then those enzymes are breaking it down into something simpler. So it's called malt because the most prevalent sugar is maltose, which is just two sugars sort of knitted together. There's a maltotriose, which is 3, a maltotetraose, which is 4, et cetera, et cetera. They just get longer and longer chains. And you want to do that. They didn't know it at the time. They didn't really know what was going on, but now we know you want to do that because yeast are really good at eating the short chain sugars and really bad at eating the long chain sugars. So if you mash and turn the long chains into short chains, you've got sugar the yeast can eat. They can turn that into alcohol and carbon dioxide for you. They were doing this without thermometers, which to me is crazy because now you want to mash at very particular temperatures, right? And often people do sort of a step mash at different temperatures to activate different enzymes. Again, my research, they would just look at it. And if you could see your reflection clearly, it was ready to go. If you couldn't, it was still too hot, right? There was still too much steam rising from it. But again, some people just cheated the system. If you didn't have malted grains or you didn't have very many malted grains, you didn't have to worry about this because you're just throwing in something like molasses and you can boil that straight away. You don't need to steep that at all. You just go straight to the boiling. And boiling does a lot of different things. It's, you're driving off excess water, so you're concentrating down those sugars and the flavors. Again, they didn't know this at the time, but you're sterilizing that wort now, that sugar water, and so that's killing all the nasty things that might be there, and this is why it was safer than the drinking water. And again, why people who drank coffee and tea, which also goes through that percolation process, was safer than just drinking water. And if you're adding your gruit or you're adding your hops or your spruce tips or whatever it was, lots of times this is happening in the boil at different stages. And then the other thing that kills me is now you've got to cool everything down. So you're boiling everything, and the next thing you want to do is add yeast, but if you add yeast to boiling anything, you kill that yeast. So how do you cool this stuff down? They basically tried to play with the seasons, right? If it was cool outside, that was good brewing weather. If it was hot outside, drink the beer you made last spring. And they would do this basically in really wide, shallow, open air vessels. Again, you've got lots of surface area, so you're letting it steam off as fast as you can. Sort of the way the Belgians do it with these open air cool ships is what they call them. And then you finally get to the fermentation process, right? So this was happening not in stainless steel. This was usually in oak barrels. you're adding yeast. Again, they had yeast. They knew yeast was this slurry of stuff that you get at the bottom of fermentation. They just didn't know that it was a living organism and what it was doing. And typically that just came from the last batch that worked out, right? So you brewed, you get this slurry, that was a good batch, okay, let's add it to the next one. If you didn't have that or your last batch went off, maybe they'd go down to the local baker, because bakers were also using yeast, not knowing what it was. And then they would let it ferment. And sometimes it went for several weeks, again, sort of depending on the temperature. The warmer things are, the faster things ferment. But sometimes it was only 12 hours, right? If you're only aiming for 0.5% alcohol, it doesn't take yeast very long to do that. So you might pitch yeast one day, the next morning you're drinking your 2.3 gallons of that beer. And it wasn't beer like we think of beer today, right? It wasn't clean. Because of that open air cooling, they were adding yeast, but they probably didn't even really need to, because Mother Nature was sprinkling in microorganisms during that entire cooling process. And you're getting wild yeast and bacteria and God knows what else in there. And so it was probably lots of these beers were sours or a little cidery. And like I said, yeast loves oak, and they're fermenting in oak. And so probably some of these casks were just impregnated with yeast to begin with. Mm-hmm. So this is what I keep harping on. Again, I'm a yeast guy, so this is going to be yeast heavy. I apologize. Nobody knew that yeast was alive. They knew it was this slurry. They had the name yeast, but they didn't know what yeast was. It was just an agent of fermentation. Some people thought it was mechanical, like, okay, if I add this, it will make fermentation happen. I don't know how, but if I add vinegar to baking soda, it makes bubbles. If I add yeast to wort, it makes bubbles. Mechanical. Chemical, really, but some people didn't even think that. They just thought it was a byproduct of fermentation, right? Fermentation happens, you get beer at the top, you get sludge at the bottom. For some reason, you add that sludge to the next one. It makes more sludge, but it also makes good beer. Mm-hmm. It's all true.
All right.
On to the next.
Beer break. So next up in our flight, we have our Berliner Weisse. This particular one is our strawberry shortcake with real vanilla beans that are used in that process. You can definitely get the hints of vanilla. I have sampled the next one, so you guys keep drinking this one because the next one's pretty special. But you get that sour, fruity, refreshing light. That's one of the reasons that we picked this next in the lineup, is kind of alluding to the fact that a lot of those beers that they were drinking were more potentially on that sour side. This one originates in the 16th and 17th centuries. Famously dubbed the Champagne of the North by Napoleon's troops because it was effervescent. And so it was not, though, until the 19th century that they started to blend this beer with more herbal and fruit liqueurs just to kind of cut the intensity of the tartness in the beer. So as you're tasting that, it's a kettle sour, so we're not, if you're going to do a lot of that spontaneous work with like those open air cool ships, you really need a separate facility. That's why you have like Upland's got like the wood shop, for example, separate facility to do that sour work compared, versus what you've got going on in your own brewery. Because I've even seen breweries where you're not allowed to eat yogurt in the back because you could be cross-contaminating, right, with all these yeasty beasties. And so for these, our Berliner is a kettle sour. It's brewed back there in our steel equipment. It's quicker to make. You're not aging it so much in the barrels. But we get to have a lot of fun with real fruit purees and different flavor profiles. So think about, as you're tasting, what notes are you getting? What ingredients are you kind of finding along the way? I think it's you. Oh, it's actually me.
Oh, yeah.
So perfect that Matt mentioned George Washington's recipe for small beer, because I actually pulled the picture of it from the New York Public Library. And yes, our founding fathers and mothers had a fondness for beer. George Washington maintained a brewery at Mount Vernon. Martha Washington, her cookbooks were found to have beer recipes, for both strong beer and small beer. She may have been brewing some on her own. A lot of them used like servants, and they also were staffed by enslaved people. So James Hemmings was known as the brewmaster at Monticello. He's the brother of Sally Hemings, worked for Thomas Jefferson, and was documented to be the brewmaster of the in-home brewery that he had. the Founding Fathers also promoted the brewing of beer in the colonies, and very often frequented taverns. And why would you promote the brewing of beer? It's not just good for the local economy, but by golly, we didn't want to be importing British beers when we're pissed off at the monarchy, right? It was one of those things that as the colonies continued to grow, we mentioned that it started with women in the kitchen. It's part of the chores. It's part of what you're doing in the home. Well, once currency was established in the colonies, well, now suddenly this is an enterprise. We can start to actually make beer. So you had people brewing at home, on their estates, for their servants, for everybody on their property. But then you started to have the birth of these taverns. And it has been said that Thomas Jefferson did draft portions of the Declaration of Independence while at a local pub. They were very inspired. So I mentioned the importance of taverns, and that's one of the biggest points that I want to make. That's France's Tavern in New York City. It's actually, I think it's owned by the Children of the American Revolution. And you can still visit it today and have a pint and eat there. It's down by Wall Street, so if you're down in the financial district. But taverns were popping up in every village. And why? Again, it became a commercial enterprise. What did they not have the tax money to build? Public houses, places where they could do meetings, things like that. Where were the taxes going? Overseas to good old King George. So it became the central meeting location for everything. They were handing out judgments there. They were having meetings. They were mustering militia. And it was a very popular place to muster militia because you could promise them free beer while they're training and doing these things. George Washington's troops were promised as part of their rations daily a quart of beer. Yeah, so that was, again, he was a big advocate for beer. Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams, James Madison, all of them were big proponents for more beer being brewed in the colonies, again, reducing what was imported in from Great Britain. So they increasingly resisted that. It's just like the tea. We didn't want the tea. We didn't want their beer, okay? Very importantly as well, it was these taverns were where they were able to share their point of view. Share that they were, being taxed without representation, to share that they weren't, that they weren't able to provide for their families, to share their ideals at the time. So we called this beer versus tyranny. This is where a lot of those ideas were shared because, again, they didn't have the spaces to meet normally. The tavern was the place. It was also the birthplace of the Freemasons as well as the United States Marine Corps. So Tun Tavern, the Marines still toast Tun Tavern. I think it was the first 2 units of the Marines were mustered out of Tun Tavern, and they celebrate that birth of their, I'm Army, so forgive me, but I don't know all those histories. But I do know that the Marines were born in a tavern, and it's a pretty cool thing to be able to say. So very, very important in terms of a location for everybody to meet up. I do like this quote that one historian wrote, that at each meeting of the Sons of Liberty raised glasses and with zeal drank a ceremonial damnation to the British ministers. Whenever Samuel Adams asked, John Hancock was quick to fund a barrel of ale. So they definitely used beer to finance, so to speak, and motivate the patriots for the revolution. All right, so now we're moving on to the most modern of our beer styles. And so we've got, this one's our MC Hazy IPA because it has Mosaic and Citra hops. So that's a fun fact on our menu. If you're like, what are all these hazies named for? The initials or the letters in front of it are usually just the letters that indicate what hops that Dan brewed in there. Very creative. This one in particular brings out notes of passion fruit, blueberry, and peach. Again, chronologically, if you look at the way that we built out this flight, the Hazy IPA, you look at what was happening on the West Coast, those were those piney West Coast IPAs, and we're looking in the early 2000s. But at the same time over in Vermont, they're doing other funky things, right? And so they decided to leave the yeast and hops particles suspended, which is why it's this unfiltered hazy. It's also often, you'll hear New England IPAs, sometimes interchangeably. I've been told that they're different things, but basically it's a juicy hop bomb.
All right, so I guess just to play off the money angle just a little bit longer, historically, fermented beverage fermented beverages are a value-added product, right? If you think about beer or wine or whiskey or whatever, you can get more for selling those products than you could the base ingredients. And it's easier for farmers too, right? If you've got bushels and bushels and bushels of grain, you can shrink that down into barrels of beer and eventually serve that in pints, right? And so it was easier for them to take that to market than, multiple wagons. It's, you can charge more per unit volume. And so it really does all come down to dollars and cents at the end of the day. And I just had an idea for maybe another beer school.
Let's do it. I might have an outfit.
Yeah. The history of modern science, or what we consider modern science in the Western Hemisphere at least, tracks with fermentation, like almost one-to-one. It's sort of scary. And so we could do a whole thing about that.
Yeah.
But it tracks that way because there was money there. Today, science is expensive. It was still expensive back then. And so you went where the money was. And so that's where we're sort of, we're ending with a modern beer. We're getting to modern brewing, right? So you heard about how they were doing it in 1776 and sort of MacGyvering things together and jumping through hoops. It really wasn't until the end of the 1800s that we got to what's really considered modern brewing. So the Bush Brewery, Anheuser, Coors, Miller were big entities in the US at the time. They're the ones that pioneered refrigeration, so cold chain to transport beer from the brewery to wherever it was going. They came up with refrigerated rail cars, and that was, a history-altering event in its own. But at the sort of technical level, there are lots of things going on in breweries as well. And Carlsberg, anybody who's ever had Carlsberg? It's been brewed forever, right, in Denmark. And they're really the ones that, on the microbiology side of things, got us to the modern level. So 1882 now, we're past 1776. Carlsberg's, they've got problems in the brewery, right? They've got bitter flavors and off odors in some of their batches. Not all of their batches, but some of them. They think they know what they're doing, right? They've been brewing for centuries, but we're having issues. As far as I can tell, they're the first brewery that had a microbiologist on staff, right? So a guy named Emil Hansen, and he was trained by Robert Koch. Anybody who's taken high school biology, you probably learned about Koch's postulates. It's a series of sort of steps. You can say, yes or no, this bacteria gives you this disease. So he was, he's the guy that came up with disease theory. He was a leading microbiologist at the time, and he trained the beer microbiologist at Carlsberg. And so what Emil did was he took his microbiological training and he went to all the different batches of beer, the ones that smelled and tasted right, the ones that smelled and tasted wrong, and he looked at the yeast, right? Are these things contaminated with bacteria, which they started to know at this time there was differences between microbes and what they might be. And Carlsberg thought they had one yeast. They said, we brew with Carlsberg yeast. He cultured 4 different yeasts, and the problems were due to one of those 4 strains, right? So, okay, step 1, we know how to find it. Anything that's got that, we just dump that batch. That's gonna end up bad. And of the other 3, only one of them, the one they called Carlsberg bottom yeast number 1, was the good one. It made the best tasting beer batch after batch after batch. And for the brewers or people in the know, bottom fermenting yeasts are lager yeast. So that's what they were brewing lagers at the time. And by 1908, so it took him a while to figure this all out and to get everybody to believe him. But by 1908, Carlsberg was exclusively brewing with that one yeast, right? They thought they had Carlsberg yeast, but now they really had it. And they named it Saccharomyces carlsbergensis after the brewery. So that is the official scientific name of lager yeast because Carlsberg figured it out. So that's your Jeopardy fact for the day.
Yeah. So just to kind of talk about as it came over to America, right? So in the 1800s, that's kind of when you saw this big surge of German immigration in the United States. And so that was a big push and a kind of a big catalyst for beer production in the United States and some of the styles that were popular here. But Prohibition happened, and that reduced the number of breweries by 60%. And you can actually see here that we probably had, in the 4,000s, and it just like drops off. It just disappears. And so then, as the home brewing trends of the 1970s kind of came to fruition, that was sort of where craft beer was born. And so back in 1990, they were tracking, when they started really tracking the numbers, 286 craft breweries in the United States, and by 2025 that number is over 9,000. I think that there's a lot of articles about what's happening in the industry now. You're starting to see about as many closures as openings, and so I think that surge is kind of ebbed a little bit, but you see this kind of curve as it comes up. But what's really interesting is I remember when my husband was brewing in Nashville and we were talking about how exciting it was that craft beer was hitting like 12% market share. And now it's more like 24, almost 25% market share. So really interesting to see the trending shift. And then our beer industry in America contributes $471 billion in economic output. So really, when you drink local craft beer, you're helping America. So Matt and I are going to take a little minute to talk about a couple of projects we're working on, and then I think we can open up if there's any questions.
Sure. So I guess just one more historical fact before I get to today. You talk about the German immigrants. So my two grandfathers, great-grandfathers on my dad's side were German immigrants who came over to, I don't know if they came to fight in the Civil War or that's just sort of where they found themselves. But they were beer guys because they were Germans. And so one of the two, my grandpa Hoff, and Hoff is the German word for hops, was a brewmaster in Pittsburgh, and his son was a brewmaster. And the family stories were always funny that they would never get driver's licenses because they were afraid people would think they were driving drunk. And so their daughters had to drive them around all the time. And support your local brewer was literally my family motto growing up before the craft beer boom, because that's what your motto was in the early 1900s as well, right? Support local, brew local, drink local. So it's good to see it come full circle.
For sure.
So 1776, right? We're rolling into the 4th of July. That's the big bang. And so Declaration of Fermentation taps Bloomington wide, I guess. Tomorrow. You'll be able to find it all over the place. But I've been reaching out to some other breweries just to see if anybody wants to do something weird, because if we can find one weird yeast, we can find 10 weird yeasts. And actually, we've got 200 or 300 in the freezer already. But hopefully you might see some more of these before 2026 ends. I've got a grad student who doesn't do this kind of thing. He does other things, but he's just been like enamored with this whole project. And he's got this idea that if we can find wild strains and brew beer with them and collect sensory data from people like you, right? This one smells this way, it tastes this way, and then sequence the genome, that we can make a database to connect the two things. And if that database is big enough, then the next time we find a weird tree yeast, we can sequence the genome and know ahead of time what kind of beer it's going to make. And that's pretty fun if we can make that happen. Now, sequencing a yeast genome costs $150. Now, compared to the human genome that was many, many tens of millions, drop in the bucket. But we need, a few of these. So I'm actively searching out funding. If anybody's got a rich uncle, let me know. The other thing is I'm department chair of biochemistry. In their infinite wisdom, IU has decided to transition the department into an institute. And so that's like my next thing I'm going to do this academic year is a bunch of paperwork and come up with a vision plan and herd cats and shepherd faculty. The institute also doesn't have a name, so if anybody's got a rich uncle who wants naming rights, let me know. Mark Cuban, whatever works. But that's sort of like my 5-year plan is we're going to develop this institute, and on the IU campus, we've got probably the greatest collection of virologists in one place anywhere in the world. So people who study HIV, people who study hepatitis viruses, people who study COVID. And as part of my vision quest for this institute is I also want to set up a center for virology at IU. So the next, COVID vaccine comes from IU Bloomington. They're already packaging it on the west side. The IP might as well come from here too. So hopefully you all will hear some more about that. It's not gonna have anything to do with beer, but we'll drink a beer to celebrate. So.
Yeah. And also I keep getting as we again, this ping pong is fun because I keep thinking of things like. If you've, there were different times in Indiana where different cities played important roles. The capital wasn't always in Indianapolis. We had Vincennes, we had Corydon. I mean, go down to Vincennes and check out the George Rogers Clark Memorial. There's a lot of history in this state. But one of the ones I was thinking about is Terre Haute Brewing Company. Because if you go over there and you see, the restaurant, The Stables, is where the stables were that pulled the the carriages that were filled with the beer. And it's not just the little craft brewery that has been kind of reborn there, but it was entire blocks of Terre Haute. That's actually where Champagne Velvet originated. Upland then actually bought the IP in Champagne Velvet. It was originally a Terre Haute Brewing Company beer. There is like a nice little exhibit or just portion of the timeline up at the Indiana State Museum that talks about beer in Indiana. And so if you're out in Terre Haute, go visit Terre Haute Brewing Company. We love them, but they've got just really cool history that you can dig into there too. Again, if you're studying history with beer, it's still learning. So a couple of things I wanted to call out. So again, I mentioned we have a Bloomington chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. It's one of the country's largest volunteer service organizations, and it's all women. They own Constitution Hall and some buildings next to the Red Cross in Washington, D.C., so right there on D Street in the heart of it. But here locally, we work on projects around historic preservation, education, and patriotism. And so July 11th, we would invite you to the courthouse, and that's going to be at 11 a.m., Saturday, 11 a.m. We put in 1986 a plaque there dedicated to the Revolutionary patriots who are buried here in Monroe County. But what's happened since 86? We've done more research. We figured out where there were things that we've added more people, or maybe there are people that are buried somewhere else. So we have replaced the plaque in honor of America's 250th. And then following that, we will have a reception. We're joining the Monroe County History Center. They're having a family-friendly block party, History on the Block, starting at noon on Saturday, July 11th, free for everybody. There's music, activities, food. Again, it's very education-centric, kid-centric, family-centric too, but we'll have a reception there. And then I have more of these. They're on the tables, but these are brochures that list all of those 30 patriots that are buried here in Monroe County. And then if you go to the website, you can actually get, for any ones that are in public cemeteries, you can actually find out how to visit them, but also get really extensive biographies about them. A couple that I'd call out that I think in particular are pretty awesome are the Brewster sisters. So 3 of those 30 are 3 women, sisters who sewed and supported the American Revolution. They're all here. And then Andrew Ferguson. Andrew Ferguson was a teenage soldier, a free man of color who ended up in Bloomington when he was collecting his revolutionary pension. But he was at the Battle of Kings Mountain. He was at Cowpens. He was all over the place. And he ended up here, and he's in Rose Hill Cemetery. So a lot of history. If you want one of these, we've got plenty. They'll be in the 4th of July parade as well.
Awesome.
Cool. All right. Any questions?
All right, so I have a question about how yeast impacts the flavor of beer, because fermentation is an actual chemical reaction that it seems to me would be the same across all types of yeast. So why do one yeast make a different flavor than another yeast?
This is a great question. So if you think about an English ale, a Belgian ale, a German ale, an American ale, it's all the exact same species. It's Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So Saccharomyces carlsbergensis is lager yeast, cerevisiae is ale yeast. But there are different subspecies or strains or isolates or however you want to get down below the species level. They're all cousins, but they're all a little bit different from one another. So in a beer that's not heavily hopped, yeast is 50% or more of the flavor. So you can brew 10 gallons of wort, split it up into 10 1-gallon fermenters, and add a different yeast. You get 10 different beers at the end of the day, even though you've got the same base ingredients. And the way that happens is it's all the same process, right? It's metabolism. You turn sugar into carbon dioxide and ethanol, but beer has so much sugar, you overload those biochemical pathways, and you get stuff that shunted off into these side pathways, and that's where the strains differ. Some have side pathways that make banana esters, and so you get those banana aromas. Some have pathways that give you these buttery flavors, and that's diacetyl, which some people like, especially the English ales. Sometimes it's a little too much. And so that's really what it is, these secondary metabolites you get from just overloading the system with a buffet of sugar. Yeah.
And I think we've also heard of some folks that are using like CRISPR technology to like edit yeast strains specifically for the brewing of beer, getting really creative. I think Dan homebrewed with one time that had used CRISPR technology. But I don't know why when you were talking, it made me think of my kids. I have 2 boys, they're 8 and 5, and they think that their dad makes yeast fart, and that's what he does for a living.
Basically, yeah.
You may not know, maybe nobody knows the answer to this question, but I'm curious why, when people were originally brewing beer, they were like, yes, I'll brew coffee and stop there. I'll brew water and stop there. I'll brew malt and then I'll ferment it. Why? Like, why didn't they just drink malt tea?
I mean, nobody really knows. So there's what's known as the Neolithic hypothesis for where fermentation started. And the hypothesis goes that ancient man or woman was out gathering grapes, right? Something sugary. And they've got a basket and you're gathering a bunch of them, and the ones in the bottom get crushed from the weight. So all of a sudden you've released those sugars, and grapes naturally have yeast on them. So that sugar is going to ferment and turn into something like wine. And so you're getting the grapes out of the basket, you see this fizzy liquid in the bottom. It smells all right, it looks all right. You're adventurous, you taste it like, oh yeah, that's all right. And so I think a lot of it was just these happy accidents that happened, and also the process that was worked out, right? You make coffee, you don't age coffee in barrels, right? You drink it right away. You can drink malt tea if you want to. It's super sweet, and that's why hops are great, because even after fermentation, there's still a lot of sugar left, so you need the bittering to balance that out. But if you put it in a vessel, like you make a bunch and you put it in a vessel and you come back later, it's changed, right? And I think they just figured out like, okay, aging is good. We don't know why. If it's bubbly, that's even better. The stuff in the bottom, we add that to the next one, that gets even better. So yeah, it's just ancient people being scientists, sort of, right? That's how we do it in the lab.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about how like the Native Americans, right? They had versions of fermented drinks that they were making with maize or corn, right? And I think about like my dad grew up on a dairy farm in Greene County, and one of the things that happened there is you've heard of the corn squeezings, right? Because you're storing corn, you've got all of this like put up, and then you've got the alcohol and the fermentation things that happen, the squeezings. The cows got into the squeezings. So you had like very happy, tipsy cows, easily tippable. But again, like these, everything that I've read going even back to the Egyptians and things like that, it was a lot of accidents. Like it just the same way that we discovered, penicillin and things like that. It's like, oh wait, like I drank this and didn't die. Like they had very different A/B experiments than we do now.
Yeah, so much. I mean, from what you've talked about today, so much of like the history of beer is defined by the history of the people that are producing it, and like you can mark like the big shifts in the way that beer is expressed and made, and the flavors that it have based on what's happening in the world. And so I'm curious. I mean, really, from both of your perspectives, how do you think? Like, what are the changes that you foresee coming in the way that beer is produced and the flavors profiles, and how does that relate to the time period, the weird time period?
Yeah, I think we're at an interesting part, especially in the craft beer timeline. So from just like, my background is in business and marketing, so I do think I kind of put my marketing hat on too, and attended some sessions at Craft Brewers Conference when it was Indy where they talked about this, because one of the things they're talking about is either how like Gen Z doesn't really drink beer as much, although right now they're getting really into Guinness, like they're getting on board, but they're also very like into but like experimental, like things like they might not drink alcohol, but they'll smoke weed or have used THC, CBD products, right? So it's an interesting thing happening. One thing we're noticing beer style trends, for example, we had a Belgian table beer. Some of these sessions and these lower ABV drinks are really trending. And you're also starting to see when you start to see companies like Athletic Brewing non-alcoholic beer, being a top 10 beer producer in the United States, what does that tell you? We're seeing trends not only of folks that just abstain from drinking alcohol, but we're also seeing, they called it, at Craft Brewers Conference, they called it zebra striping, where you're like, I want to drink 6 beers but drive home, so I'm going to drink 1 NA and an alternate, and we're just going to go back and forth, because now I've socially, because it goes back to sociology and people, because what we're seeing now is you have to, when you can go to Big Red Liquors and get world-class craft beer, why would you come here? And you're coming here for, we often hear about third spaces. You're coming here for trivia. You're coming here to meet friends. You're coming somewhere for a meal. You're coming to play pinball. And for world-class beer. But it's not. It's more than that, right? The pandemic taught us that we can stay home and get a lot of things. Look at what's happening to movie theaters, right? And so I think what I foresee is it's going to be all about social occasions. I think Gen Z is one of the most authentic generations that I've kind of viewed, and that they really value, like, as much as they're in the digital space, they also still value that connection. I think across the generations, you're going to crave that connection. So I think it's all going to be occasions-based, lower ABV trends, maybe less on the, like some of the styles that have, and even resurgences. Our West Coast IPA has been really popular, and that kind of fell out of trendy favor for a while. So that's what I'm thinking. So Belgian table beer is coming back. Right?
I guess I see two different mutually exclusive things happening, or at least I'd like to see them happening. So history repeats itself, right? We talked about the Reinheitsgebot, we talked about Carlsberg getting it down to one yeast. When things like that happened, brewing changed worldwide. It got really homogenized. Everything became sort of the same. Budweiser tastes different than Coors, Coors tastes different than Miller, but put the three of those against one of these beers, you're instantly going to be able to pick out the Heartwork beer, right? And we lost so much of historical beer because everybody said, okay, we have to do it the same way because this is the safe way to do it. We know we're going to have to dump less. This, it's going to be the easier way to make money. I'm all about making money. I get that. But what did we lose? And so I think some of that historical stuff is going to come back, and it already has, right? We've got a 1776 inspired beer here. Beer is brewed with two yeasts, ale yeast and lager yeast. There are 1 million yeasts on planet Earth. They can't all make beer, and even the ones that can don't all make good beer, but there are other species out there that we could use. And in Africa, they use a bug called Schizosaccharomyces pombi, and pombi is the Swahili word for beer. Right, that's why they named it after it. So just natively, that was the one that was rich in that environment. And so I see some of that probably getting away from this macro trend of playing it safe and brewing with two yeasts. The other thing I think is brewers are going to start to take advantage of modern science. There are these CRISPR strains where people have built them to release aromas from hops. So there are aromatic molecules that are just trapped in the hops. You brew with these special yeasts. They release it so it smells like guava. You don't even have to add guava. You get this great guava burst. And it sort of sounds like science fiction, but for $500 right now, I could create a yeast that makes psilocybin for the Gen Zs. And you don't have to do anything else to the beer. You can make work like you normally would. You would put this yeast in there. You would get ethanol, carbon dioxide, and psilocybin at an unknown dose.
You gotta call Jeff Meeks. You love that.
But you could do the same thing with THC. You could do the same thing with vanilla. Lots of imitation vanilla comes from yeast, right? They've built it to make this vanilla. So you could build in all these crazy biochemical pathways into a yeast and make beer and have it taste or smell or glow in the dark. We did a glow in the dark beer for the Buskirk Chumley. It was a lot of fun. So I think we're gonna see some of that stuff too. Yeah.
Any? Yes.
I'm going to go back to your personal history in Pittsburgh because we are heading there on Tuesday to move our daughter out there.
All right.
So where do we go to drink that we can get a taste of your family history or just really good beer in Pittsburgh?
So Penn Brewery is probably like the old standby, and it's actually in old brewing space that my grandfather actually occupied. So you could get some his stuff there. There's a German restaurant called Max's Allegheny Tavern, and there's a picture of my great-grandfather when he was just a kid in the back of a goat-drawn cart outside of the brewery up on the wall. Dancing Gnome is a great brewery. Church Brewworks is, if you like pierogies, Church Brewworks has lots of pierogies.
And it's in a church.
And it's in a deconsecrated church.
We have that marked on a map, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
And the other, if you're sort of north of the city at all, there's the Iron City Brewery and Distillery. Iron City is basically Pittsburgh's version of Bud Miller Coors. So that's what it is. But it's an awesome tasting room they've got there. You can take a tour, you can check out the distillery, and they make things that aren't just American macro lager. I don't know why they don't distribute them more, but you can get them in the tasting room. So I had a really, really good time there over, I guess, Thanksgiving break at the Iron City place. So I'd check that out if you can. Yeah.
Anyone else?
You mentioned the brewery, if they have a failed batch, potentially going to a bakery to get yeast. Is that like in the form of like a sourdough, or like what was the process for that?
Yeah, so I mean, they were dealing with basically the same slurry, right? If you ever have a sourdough culture, right, you feed it, you split it, you keep feeding it, and that's basically what the bakeries were doing, because they're baking every day, right? So you keep that culture going, and sometimes their culture would go bad. It got too hot, or something nasty got into it, or the dogs got into it, or whatever. And if that happened, they would go to the local farmer who was making beer and grab his yeast and take it back. So it went in both directions. But yeah, these weren't the Carlsberg one yeast cultures. There were lots of different things in there.
Yeah. And I know I was looking it up on my phone. I was like, what was that called again? Because I remember one time you talk about the similarities. I always told Dan, because I love baking and he loves brewing, and I'm like, that's such delayed gratification. I like great. But I remember he homebrewed a kvass. And so he took a loaf of rye bread and actually boiled it and went through the entire process, just from boiling down that bread and kind of getting it from there. And so there's a lot of crossovers. There's a reason when you're back there, I feel like it can often smell very bready. Of course, if it's hop state, it smells very funky. But yeah.
That's where the expression scraping the bottom of the barrel comes from, too.
Yeah, and another just like a fun thing about what we do here at Heartwork that most of our local craft breweries do is that those spent grains, after our brewing process, we put them in bins and they're picked up by local farmers, because I mean we're using really high quality grains, and those makes really high quality feed for pigs and cattle and things. And so I think our local craft breweries have a really nice kind of cycle of helping, the local farmer gets the feed for free as long as they pick it up and bring the bin back. So, fun fact.
Yeah, pretty sure you might have just answered my question. So I grew up in Wisconsin. There are a gazillion breweries, microbreweries before the microbreweries, right? Like Weisse, like all these things. But the beer all tasted similar, and I think what I'm hearing from you is that's because the yeast variation was all these brewers in the 60s and 70s, and small breweries that they all taste like American yellow.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you're like local, and back in the day, Wisconsin was geographically isolated for the most part, and that's why those breweries existed when all the other ones sort of got absorbed, because they were off the beaten path. But yeah, probably they were doing the same trading back and forth, like, hey, can we get some of your yeast, or you guys can have some of ours? Or if somebody worked at a brewery and jumped ship and opened his own, he was probably taking yeast out the door with him, and that's how it happened.
And recipes, yeah.
But it's funny, you go to the big macros, like if you tour a Coors facility, everything is squeaky clean, and they've told me they don't want anybody stealing the Coors yeast. I'm thinking, who wants Coors yeast? Because it's easy to make a beer that doesn't taste like anything, so. But it's under lock and key, like literally in sort of like Brinks trucks between the different breweries.
Yeah.
So how do we get from a Carlsberg to a Coors Light or a Natty Ice in the 90s or whatever? Like, what are the terrible things that happened to make that?
So that's a great question, and people have researched that and written about it extensively. It was the American palate, right? Europe, by and large, was a cooler climate. Like if you just look on a globe, like the latitude, most of Europe is high latitude. It's like Maine. But you get here, summers are hot, it's warm, people want something that's light and refreshing and crushable, right? That you can sit down and drink some. And in the like post-Civil War era, when the Germans started flexing their muscles and making their hometown lagers and things, that's what people wanted. They're like, oh, we're done drinking stouts. Give us this lager, give us this Pilsner. And it just was a taste thing. The same thing happened in the IPA world with hazies. I'm over hazies, but you go to Kroger, that's all you see on the freaking shelf are hazy IPAs, man. I would love to just get a 6-pack of brown ale.
Yeah.
Well, did fillers go in there at some point too?
Fillers.
Like World War II, wasn't there like rice?
Rice and corn and
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I think ingredients based on availability. Jacob, you had.
No, I was going to say I have an answer to that as well.
Yeah. Give it.
So one of the reasons is Prohibition, and after Prohibition, there was a big move to try to make beer appealing to the widest market, and specifically to make beer appealing to the people that were buying it, who were at the time women, who were going and purchasing. So there is a shift towards what probably male brewers thought of as the most feminine style of beer, which was a lot of rice, a lot of stuff to make it as mild as possible. And it was also around the same time that we started to see the rise of 6-packs, which made beer more easy to carry. So the shift towards a tasteless beer was very intentional, and it was because all of the brewers were like, oh my God, we don't want them to get rid of beer again. We don't want to.
Yeah, women were some of the biggest proponents for Prohibition because they felt it caused all the problems. It was the reason that domestic violence happened. It was the reason that the paychecks weren't making it home. And so you could see a lot of the most staunch supporters for Prohibition were women. And it's interesting when you talk about how the American palate tastes and how formerly I worked for Mars Incorporated, so the company that makes M&Ms and Snickers and all that fun stuff. And so one of the interesting things that happened is that we had an M&Ms shortage, okay? And it was, you never noticed it, but we noticed it. Because what happened is, like, if you eat an M&M off like the assembly line in Hackettstown, New Jersey, it tastes like a rich, like Godiva chocolate truffle, right? And then we let it go sit and get stale, so Americans like to eat it. And so then what happened is something happened. There was either a batch that got, had to get thrown out or something like that. So they started to rush the M&Ms out onto the shelf, and the consumer feedback was horrific. These M&Ms don't taste right. They don't taste good at all. But if they'd been packaged up as tiny candy lentils from Godiva, they would have sold. So it really is about the taste, and why sometimes you go to other countries and, depending on what sugars are being used, or whether it's corn syrup, sweeteners, they're different recipes in different places, and some countries don't like as sweet of a dessert as we have here.
I also kind of wonder if you had alluded to this before, but the rise of manufacturing and wanting everything to be the same and fit into your process and not have a lot of mistakes and waste, that push towards uniformity that was, I feel like, the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, people wanted everything to be exactly the same.
Yeah, so I've got a buddy who got his brewing certificate at UC Davis. So UC Davis is a big hub of brewing research and education. And the first day of the class, the instructor goes around the room and says, okay, what's your favorite beer? So, well, I love Heartwork, I love Guinness, I love whatever it is. And it gets back to him, he says, I think the best beer in the world is Bud Light. And everybody just jaw drops, right? Because these are people coming from the craft brew scene, or they want to get into the craft brew scene. What the hell do you mean? And he's like, a can of Bud Light that you buy here, or you buy in Asia, or you buy in Africa, tastes exactly the same. Consistency. Yeah. And there is nothing to hide behind in that can. You can't toss a bunch of hops in there and hide an off flavor or the color or it being hazy. It's got to be spot on. And so the Industrial Revolution hit beer so that they could do that. Millions and millions of pounds of grain from different lots worldwide being homogenized so you can make exactly the same product even though you're separated by thousands of miles. And so it's amazing, and it is remarkable that they can do that, but the trade-off is everything's Bud Light.
Yeah. I mean, it's good for hydration, right? Like, we drink it all summer. One thing I'd mention is when we teach off flavor tasting, so we buy these kits and you add these things to the beer so that we can train our staff to figure out when something is off, hopefully before you guys get to it. But we don't use our beers because these are craft beers, and again, they're more unique, they can mask things. We use Coors Banquet. Coors Banquet is the beer that we use as like kind of the most like chill, neutral, like beer that we'll add these things to so you can catch that nuance and catch that scent. And so, yeah, they play an important role.
Yeah.
And then we'll drink them after. I'm not hating. Anyone else? Any other questions? All right, you guys. Class is dismissed.